The wind howled through the empty field, swirling around the forgotten corner of the world where Toby lay. He was a shepherd dog, once full of life, his coat thick and shiny, his eyes bright with the curiosity that only a young dog can possess. But that was before he was abandoned. Toby had known a different life once. He remembered running through the open fields, his paws swift on the grass as he herded sheep for his owner. He was the pride of the farm, his loyalty unwavering, his work tireless. His thick coat was a crown of sorts, an emblem of his hard work, and he wore it proudly. But now, his coat had begun to mat with dirt and filth, his bones sharper beneath the fur. His once bright eyes were dim, clouded with hunger and confusion. The fence that now held him prisoner was a rusty, sagging barrier that seemed to mock his former life. It wasn't always like this. There had been a time when he had a warm place to sleep at night, food that filled his stomach, and the constant company of his owner. But somewhere along the way, things had changed. The farmhouse grew quieter, the chores grew fewer. The owner grew older and more distant, until one day, there was no food, no calls for Toby to herd the sheep, no pats on the head for a job well done. One day, Toby found himself left alone in the field. Tied to the fence by a heavy, cruel rope, he couldn't even move far enough to find a shady spot when the sun blazed down, or seek shelter from the rain. The days stretched long, one blending into the next, as Toby waited for the kindness he had once known. But it never came. His stomach ached. At first, the hunger was a dull throb, but soon it became a gnawing, relentless pain. His body grew weaker with each passing day, and his thoughts blurred together. He barked occasionally, his voice hoarse from lack of use, but no one came. His owner didn't come, nor did anyone else. Toby could only watch as the world passed by, the fields growing wild around him, the seasons changing with no one to witness them. Then, on a day that started like any other, something changed. It was late afternoon when the sound of approaching footsteps reached Toby's ears. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, a trick of his starved mind. But then he heard it again, clearer this time, the crunch of boots on the dry earth, the soft murmurs of voices. The footsteps grew closer, and Toby's heart began to race. His body trembled with a strange mix of hope and fear. Was it his owner returning? Had he come to take him back, to feed him, to bring him home? Toby's ears perked up, his tail, weak as it was, twitched in anticipation. As the people came into view, Toby saw something he had never expected. A group of strangers, all wearing bright vests with large letters that read, "Volunteer," on them. They didn't belong here. They weren't familiar, but they moved with purpose, scanning the field as if they knew exactly where to look. One of them, an older woman with kind eyes, spotted Toby almost immediately. She gasped, her hands trembling as she stepped toward him. "Oh, poor thing," she murmured, dropping to her knees. "What has happened to you?" Toby's heart thudded in his chest. He wanted to move, to get closer, but his legs felt like jelly. The rope around his neck was tight, digging into his skin. He let out a low whine, his eyes locked on the woman, desperate for some kind of comfort. Another volunteer, a tall man with a thick beard, crouched down next to her. "We need to get him out of here," he said urgently. "This place is no good for him." The woman nodded, reaching out carefully, her hands gentle as they untied the rope from the fence. It took a few moments, but it felt like a lifetime to Toby. When the knot finally came undone, the rope fell away, and Toby was free for the first time in what felt like forever. His legs wobbled, and for a moment, he simply stood there, unsure what to do. The woman's hands were soft on his fur as she helped him to stand. "It's okay, boy," she said softly, her voice soothing. "We're going to take care of you. You're safe now." Toby looked up at her, his eyes filled with confusion and hope. Could it be true? Was he really free? He wanted to believe it, but the fear that had settled in his bones was not easily shaken. He had been abandoned once before. How could he know this time would be different? The volunteers worked together, guiding Toby gently toward their van. They had a plan, a place to take him, a shelter where he could be cared for and begin to heal. Toby didn't understand all of it, but he knew one thing for sure: these people were kind, and they were not going to let him starve. As they drove away from the field, Toby settled on the floor of the van, his head resting against the cool metal. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, his eyelids fluttered shut. He was safe for now. He was no longer tied to the fence, no longer abandoned. But what lay ahead? He didn't know. One thing was certain. The road to recovery was long, but it was a road he would not have to walk alone. The shelter was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the cold, empty field where Toby had spent his days of solitude. As soon as the van doors opened, Toby was greeted by the hum of activity. There were other dogs in cages, some barking excitedly, others lying quietly, their eyes watching every movement. The volunteers helped Toby out of the van, guiding him through the entrance where soft lights illuminated the space, and the scent of food and cleanliness filled the air. Toby could hardly believe it. For the first time in so long, he felt like he was in a place where he could rest without fear. The shelter was a far cry from the desolate field he'd come from, but it wasn't yet home. The people were kind, yes, but they were strangers. And Toby was still afraid. His trust was something that had to be earned again, piece by piece. The first few days at the shelter were difficult for Toby. Despite the warmth and food, he felt out of place. The other dogs were loud and boisterous, running around the yard and vying for attention from the staff. Toby didn't know how to interact with them. He had been isolated for so long that the sound of a barking dog felt foreign, even unsettling. He kept to himself, curled in a corner of his kennel, his tail tucked tightly between his legs. The shelter staff was patient, though. They understood that dogs like Toby needed time to adjust. The older woman who had first found him, named Clara, came to visit him every day. She sat beside his kennel, speaking to him in soft, gentle tones, offering him treats, and even just sitting silently in his presence. Toby wasn't ready to trust her completely, but he began to feel a small flicker of something in his heart. The loneliness he had endured was slowly starting to ease. One day, Clara opened the door to his kennel and sat down on the floor next to him. She held out her hand, palm up, and Toby eyed her warily. It took a long moment before he cautiously approached, sniffing her fingers. When he found no threat, he allowed her to pet him gently along the back of his neck. The contact was comforting, and a quiet sigh escaped Toby's chest. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to relax. "You re a good boy, Toby," Clara said softly. "You re going to be okay." Toby didn't know what that meant, but he wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that there was still a chance for him to have a life filled with love and kindness. The memory of the field where he had been abandoned was still sharp, but it was beginning to fade, replaced by the sense of hope that Clara and the others were slowly helping him build. The weeks passed, and Toby's condition improved. He gained weight, his coat began to shine once more, and his muscles regained their strength. The transformation was slow, but it was evident to everyone who watched. Toby was becoming more alert, more present in the world around him. One afternoon, while Clara was taking him on a walk through the shelter's outdoor yard, something unusual happened. A couple arrived, an elderly man and woman. They were quiet, kind-faced people, both with the slow, measured steps of age, but there was something about the way they moved, together, that caught Toby's attention. He watched them as they passed by his kennel, sniffing the air, his ears perked. The man smiled softly as he looked at Toby, who was watching him intently. The woman, her silver hair pulled back into a neat bun, looked down at Toby with a knowing look. "I think he's the one, George," she said to her husband. "Look at those eyes." George, the man, bent down to Toby's level, and the dog instinctively took a few steps forward. There was no hesitation, no fear in Toby now. He was curious, drawn to this couple in a way he couldn't explain. "Hey there, boy," George said softly, his voice calm and steady. "You look like you've had a rough time, huh?" Toby didn't bark or wag his tail, but he stood still, his gaze never leaving George. There was something about the gentleness in his voice that made Toby feel safe. It was the same feeling he'd had when Clara first began speaking to him. A quiet assurance that he was in the presence of someone who wouldn't hurt him, someone who would be kind. The woman, whose name was Alice, bent down beside George. She smiled warmly, her hands gentle as she reached out to stroke Toby's back. "Oh, look at him," she said. "He's such a good boy, I can tell." Toby let them pet him, his tail beginning to wag ever so slightly. There was something different about this couple. something that made him feel like he belonged. It wasn't the same as the days when he ran free on the farm, but it was a feeling he hadn't known in so long: comfort, safety, and something even deeper, the possibility of a new beginning. Alice and George spent the next hour with Toby, talking to him, offering him treats, and letting him get to know them. Clara watched from a distance, sensing that something was happening, but she didn't interfere. She'd seen this before. She knew that sometimes, a dog just knew when it had found its people. Finally, Alice turned to Clara, her eyes bright with hope. "We'd like to adopt him," she said. "We've been thinking about it for a while, and I think Toby is the one." Clara smiled warmly, though there was a small pang of sadness in her chest. She had grown so fond of Toby, and it would be hard to let him go. But she knew this was what was best for him. He needed a home, a place where he could truly heal and feel loved. "Let's get the paperwork started," Clara said. "I think Toby will be very happy with you." The day Toby was adopted was filled with a mixture of joy and bittersweetness. Clara, the shelter staff, and all the other dogs gathered to see him off, their barks and tail wags a chorus of encouragement. Clara gave Toby one last gentle pat on the head before the couple, Alice and George, led him out of the shelter. Toby's paws felt lighter than they had in months, as though the weight of his past was beginning to lift. The van ride was a quiet one, with Toby nestled in the back, his head resting against Alice's lap as she gently stroked his fur. George drove, his hands steady on the wheel as he occasionally glanced at the rearview mirror, making sure Toby was comfortable. "This is it, Toby," Alice whispered softly. "This is your new home." Toby had never known a home like this before. As they drove through the quiet streets, he noticed how different everything felt. There were no harsh sounds, no distant yells or threats of abandonment. It was peaceful, serene, a place where he could let his guard down and be the dog he was meant to be. When they arrived at their house, Toby's curiosity piqued. The house was small but well kept, surrounded by a lush garden. The scent of flowers and freshly cut grass filled the air, and Toby felt an overwhelming sense of calm wash over him. He was finally somewhere safe, a place where he wouldn't have to worry about going hungry or being left alone. The front door opened, and Alice and George stepped out with Toby on his leash. The house had a small yard where Toby could run and explore. The grass felt cool under his paws, and for the first time in ages, he felt a sense of freedom. He wandered around the yard, sniffing at the bushes and flowers, his tail wagging slowly but steadily. "This is your space, Toby," George said with a smile, his voice deep and steady. "You're free to roam here, as much as you want. But always remember, we'll be right here with you." Toby looked up at them, his eyes wide with wonder. He hadn't expected to feel so at home, so wanted. He had been abandoned and forgotten, tied to a fence with no hope of escape. But now, he had a family. He had a place where he belonged. In the days that followed, Toby began to adjust to his new life. He was a little hesitant at first, unsure of the routine, the new faces, and the way Alice and George moved through the house. But slowly, as the days turned into weeks, he learned to trust them. He learned that he would never go hungry again. He learned that his soft bed would always be waiting for him at the end of each day. Alice and George took him on long walks every morning. They showed him the nearby park where Toby could run freely, his legs stretching out with each joyful stride. He discovered the joy of chasing after a ball, of having someone to play with, someone who would cheer him on with every successful catch. George's slow, steady gait matched Toby's pace perfectly, and Alice would laugh, her voice light and full of love as she called out, "Good boy, Toby. You're doing great." Even though Toby couldn't fully express his gratitude, he showed it in the small ways. When George would sit down in his favorite chair, Toby would settle at his feet, his head resting gently on George's lap. When Alice cooked in the kitchen, Toby would lie patiently by the door, waiting for a scrap of food to fall, or simply to be near her. As the weeks went by, Toby's transformation was nothing short of miraculous. His coat became shiny once again, his muscles strong and firm. He no longer looked like the sad, malnourished dog who had once been abandoned at that lonely fence. His spirit, too, began to heal. He was no longer the fearful, anxious dog he had been. Instead, he was a dog who could love and be loved in return. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden light over the yard, Toby found a place beside Alice and George on the porch. They sat together in the cool evening air, the sounds of crickets chirping in the distance. Toby rested his head on George's knee, his eyes closing in contentment. Alice smiled, her hand resting lightly on Toby's back. "I'm so glad we found you, Toby," she said softly. "You've brought so much joy into our lives." George chuckled, his voice gruff but warm. "You're our little miracle, Toby. We've been waiting for you." Toby didn't understand all the words, but he understood the meaning behind them. He understood the love, the warmth, and the safety they offered him. For the first time in so long, he felt like he truly belonged. He had a family, a home, and a life full of care and comfort. And though he couldn't remember much of the days before, those long, lonely hours tied to the fence, he didn't need to. He had found a new beginning. A place where he was no longer a forgotten dog, but a beloved companion, cherished and protected. As the stars began to twinkle above, Toby settled in, feeling the weight of the past finally lift. He had found his forever home, and it was exactly where he was meant to be.